Hi, welcome to Let Them Talk. I'm Paul DiRienzo, and our show today is basically me and you. And we're going to flash the phone number so you can call. This a live program. This is Let Them Talk. I'm Paul DiRienzo. And we're going to, I'm just going to vent for the next 28 minutes. And I guess the thing I want to vent the most about is Donald J. Trump. I withhold calling him President Donald J. Trump, because I don't want to legitimize him in any way, legitimate his rule. And, legitimate rule, what is that? It means people would trust a person enough that if they declared a war, they would actually sign up their children to fight in it. So if a government doesn't have legitimacy among its people, then the reality is that it can't depend on its people in case of conflict, because nobody's going to trust sending their children off to fight in a war ruled by somebody who has no legitimacy with the public. So here's our guest that's just arrived, Ian Williams. Welcome, Ian. And we're going to talk more about this subject because the legitimation of a government is the key thing. It's a very key thing. And one of the key things about legitimacy, here, I'll get it for you. One of the key things about legitimacy I was discussing, Ian, was that if a president does not have the legitimacy of its people, the country they rule, that their parents won't send their children off to fight in a war. That's really what it means. That's the underlying thing. So that if a war with North Korea occurred, or an attack occurred in which U.S. troops were put into battle, into the front, that there would be huge unrest at home because people wouldn't want to send their kids. As I remember, and you must remember from the 1970s, a lot of conservative, Christian, American first type people became so disenchanted with the Vietnam War and with the presidents who had sent their children to die. It should have been to kill, but we'll take
Yes.
we'll take what we can get. And discovered that that it was the government had no legitimacy really, and in the end they took the president down, Richard Nixon, on that basis.
Well, you remember one of the books I wrote was Deserter, a study
really?
of George Bush's war record.
Right.
And it was really interesting to study the before and after aspects.
Yes.
When in the beginning, George H.W. Bush
Uh-huh.
volunteered. He left school early at 18.
Right.
Because the American ruling class then was sort of noblesse oblige. They were eager. They wanted
Yes.
to go and do their stuff, strut their stuff.
Yeah, I'll put this under your hand here. That's right. Yes, absolutely.
And then by the time it came to that era, we have almost every leading figure in politics now squirmed right up their own rectums to avoid going.
Who would have gone to Vietnam?
George W. Bush. But they actually actively supported it, but didn't want to go.
Right. Why
It
is
was a
that? What does that
separate issue.
reflect in their mentality and thinking? An utter
I
selfishness?
It's difficult because I think they basically disowned their own country. It wasn't their country anymore. They didn't see why they should die for it. It was for other people to do it. I mean, they treated the US as a corporate enterprise. They were the CEO, and their job was to loot it.
That's
Even before, I think, God knows they were robber barons, and they were brutal, and they were greedy. But they felt it was a corporate enterprise with all of them concerned, with everyone concerned, a body corporate, a nation.
World War I and World War II.
World War I, people actually volunteered to go and fight for the French beforehand because they were so eager,
Absolutely.
but at this time.
And there was, during even the 1930s, among the ruling class was a tremendous patriotic movement to get us into the war. But that conflicted. There was always a strain of isolationism in American society, as well as know-nothing, anti-immigrant feeling, and also the Young America. I don't know if you're familiar with Young America.
Yeah,
was a 19th century movement that's reflected in the youth movement even today. Horrors. I came out of that. Right. That was very, at its root, very racist, and to the extent that they didn't even consider as slaves black people. They didn't even exist in their thinking and their calculations.
Well, I think this is part of the problems of the U.S. as a nation, is that there's a considerable proportion of the population, and Trump tapped them to them, who do not think black Americans are part of their nation. They don't think Latin Americans are part of their nation. And I mean, the key figure, many people, when I've asked, why don't you have a national health service here in the US? Right. If you look at the FDR, one of the great progressives, the New Deal was specifically written to exclude black Americans from benefiting. All of the occupations in which they were strongest, they were written out. When they were conscripted, They didn't go. They were put in labor battalions.
Right.
They were not integrated. It was Truman who integrated the military.
After World War II.
Yes. And everyone's forgotten. This history just goes, and the sort of most of the population thinks, why are they still grousing about this? Well, I'm sorry, if your father was sent to the back of a bus or was told you're not good enough to fight, but you're good enough to go and dig a trench in, in the nuclear site, that's fine.
Right.
Then
it
goes down the generations, and it's understandable.
Right. Why people would say what, but even as far back as Frederick Douglass, that what is your 4th of July to me? What is your flag to me? It doesn't really mean anything. Independence for slaves, it doesn't exist.
Samuel Johnson said it best.
How did he say it?
The guy who wrote the dictionary.
Oh, yeah.
In 1776, he wrote, "Why is it that the yelps for liberty come loudest from the fluggers of slaves and the sellers of Negroes?"
Right. The Constitution. Today, when I was listening to highlights from Jeff Sessions' testimony, I like to count the amount of times he said he was there to protect the Constitution.
Yeah.
And while I am not in favor of a new constitutional convention to rewrite the Constitution, because who would be in charge of the rewrite? At the same time, I fully understand that the Constitution of the United States was written in the time of slavery and has even the 13th Amendment, which freed the slaves. You can see the film Lincoln by Spielberg, was a compromise because they wrote as
Lincoln was an astute politician. Yeah. It's difficult to be purer than now. I am glad we got the New Deal, even though it did exclude people.
And the Emancipation Proclamation,
yes,
even though it would allow whites to say we freed the slaves for generations after.
And if you look even further, the recent work that's come out about how the federal government, without legislation, mandated racial discrimination in housing loans, for example.
Absolutely.
All of this stuff
Donald
is there.
Trump and
Donald Trump was a big part
his
of
father,
this. His father, yes.
Fred Trump.
Yeah. And, by the way, I have to say this about Donald Trump. He has no compunctions about renting and selling apartments to rich African Americans, to rich Arabs, to rich almost anybody. Right. What he's not going to tolerate is having poor welfare people
anywhere
near his apartments, or poor people. Full stop.
Right. A couple of questions, because I wanted to begin by asking you if you thought that Donald Trump was a fascist or not, but I also wanted to ask you, for no other reason, the expertise conveyed by your accent. What do you think about Brexit and the elections in England just a few days ago, in which it seemed like the Bernie Sanders wing, at least that's what we're led to believe, did very well?
We were there before Bernie Sanders, but yes. Yeah. The first thing about Donald Trump is, look, he really doesn't have the intellectual capacity to be a fascist.
That's interesting you say that.
Fascism is a sort of thought-out philosophy. You mightn't agree with it, but there's a corporatism. And part of this, by the way, is completely un-American. Mm-hmm. The fascist states in Britain tried to look after people, as long as you were the right, appropriate ethnology. But
they were big spenders. Hitler's
Nazi Germany was
the
National Socialist German Workers' Party.
Absolutely.
And they provided basic welfare. They looked after the German people, as long as they were Aryan. They looted the rest of the continent to do this during the war, by the way. They literally starved Poland and the eastern colonies and France to keep the German workers happy and well fed. In Italy, and even Spain to some extent.
Germany first. Wouldn't be like, well, we have America first.
No, heaven forbid. So, in that sense, fascism is a sort of well thought out corporate philosophy, and I get upset when it's used as sloppy talk for racism. So Mussolini was not really racist, but he did. Basically, he thought the society was a corporation and he should run it, and people. And a corporation, in the old sense of everybody working together, and the people in their proper stations, this is like guilds. The workers were looked after; they were paid. There were rules; it had to be obeyed. And not like here. I mean, what we have with Trump is the mixture of neoliberalism and egoism, which is frightening.
He bought the presidency because he was mad that the President Obama had embarrassed him in public at the dinner, at the press dinner. I mean, that was very. I would be, I wouldn't be Donald Trump, but if one was Donald Trump, they would be pretty humiliated at how he was talked down to and read the Riot Act basically by President Obama after years of pushing this. Obama's a Muslim. Obama's not an American citizen. Where was he born? All these kind of things.
Look, I mean, Trump is an interesting character. I've been writing about him since the early 90s. I've said this guy is a total business failure. Why are people admiring him? You know, I was here for the Trump. Everyone remember the Trump shuttle?
Yeah,
Bankrupt.
Yes. Yeah, it didn't
The
last
Trump
long.
Plaza
Trump
sold
steaks.
at a loss.
Yeah, right.
The
Yes.
Taj Mahal sold.
Right.
I mean, the guy is a crumbling, carrying on failure. He should be fired.
Then
if
who owns
anyone
him?
is.
Who owns Donald Trump? He's, you know, if that's true, the next would be somebody's financing him, somebody's pouring money.
Well,
into
Rupert
these
Murdoch was the same. I mean, there were times when if the banks had blown the whistle on Rupert Murdoch, he would have gone under. And if you remember the similar figure in Britain, Robert Maxwell, he did go
yeah, I
under
remember
because they
him,
blew the
right.
whistle on
That was
Robert
a while
Maxwell.
ago. That was a while ago. Yeah,
He
I
built
remember.
up a whole house of cards on inflated debt and promises.
Yeah.
And as soon as they were called in, that's when he committed suicide. It was pushed over the boat, or by the side of the boat, or whatever.
Right, I remember. Right.
Yeah.
Now you're reminding me of that.
Yeah, and you know, he and Murdoch were parallel characters, but it was all down to timing. Murdoch managed to keep his breath going, and where Trump and the others have the advantage is that the banks lose a lot of money if they declare him bankrupt. If they fire him,
I see.
then they've lost all that money. Whereas at least they have the residual hope that, you know, the stocks will go up, the shell will go up, real estate will go up, and they can get what they want out of him.
What do you think? I mean, I've had guests on my other show on WBAI. I have a show on WBAI now at 6:30 called Trump Watch. And we're basically talking about stuff that I'm expanding it out to this show. And both shows we're talking more and more about Donald Trump and whether or not he's a fascist. That's the question I pose. And I get many different responses. I'm curious really on the response.
I don't think he's a fascist, but he's a very, very bad influence on
right.
whatever.
And that's other, most
people,
actually most have said things along those lines, although a few hold out that basically as an argument that people should not wait for the next election in order to get out on the streets and start doing stuff. So if he's a fascist, it's sort of a rationale to get going now. You better get going now. You might lose everything. But on the other hand, most people who study the guy, like you have and written about him, consider him basically an incompetent boob.
Well, it can't be that incompetent. He's made a lot of money, and also he has a great talent, like Hitler and Mussolini. He knows how to get people moving. You know, we forgot that. I was watching his speeches and comparing with Hillary's, for example.
Yes.
And I could see he was scoring points. He was being mocked and scorned for speeches that the audience were lapping it up. Yeah. And part of this is, you know, he's a millionaire who's a billionaire, or quasi-billionaire, who's managed to pass himself up as Joe Soap.
Right. Well,
and he's done it because he is genuinely not an intellectual.
Yeah.
You're never going to see him at the opening of the Met.
He has not a book in his house.
They
say everybody says not. They've never seen him read a book in his lives.
Yeah. He's not going to go to the opening of the opera. You're not going to see him at the theater. You're not going to see him
not because he's like Lyndon Johnson, who had the dispensers of bourbon on his desk filled with Scotch whiskey.
This guy doesn't drink, and that's another thing I can't tolerate about him. As the historian of rum,
he doesn't drink. Trump doesn't drink.
Apparently not. No.
Yeah, which is unusual.
Doesn't smoke, doesn't drink.
Right, but the
Hitler.
I want to talk.
Hitler was a non-smoker as well, by the way.
Right.
Determined non-smoker.
Right. Because I was mentioning that I read about Lyndon Johnson, and that to create this idea that he was like a folksy Southern guy, when really he was married to the richest woman in Texas. He would have bourbon bottles, you know, a traditional American drink of somewhat lower quality than high imported Scotch, single malt Scotch, and that's what he would fill the bourbon bottles with, his Scotch, and it would look like he was drinking the people's drink when he was really drinking what the richest guy in Texas would be drinking.
Well, BJ had the common touch in many ways, and you know, I think he had a look. I think LG.
So you're saying the common touch is more important than really doing it?
Yeah, I mean, Hillary did not have the common touch at all.
No. She tried.
She
came to my house.
You get back to it. I mean, Theresa May. It was sort of Hillary Clinton, ignorance plus Hillary Clinton's arrogance. I mean, it was a crucial mixture.
They both. Well, she dropped her papers today. I noticed on it was pretty funny actually when she tried to scoop.
Well,
them up.
I mean, she should be covering her back because her own party will be trying to stick the knife in her back.
Right now, she's on the string of basically the Ulster Unionists, one of the most reactionary right-wing groups in the whole.
It's not just the Ulster Unionists, it's the Democratic Unionist Party, which was Ian Paisley's party. Ian Paisley got an honorary degree from the Bob Jones University.
Oh, right, Christian right-wing.
Yeah, we are talking about a mixture of bigoted Anglo-Irish Protestantism.
So it's going together. But it seems to be, I mean, there seems to be some dream that the alt-right had that this is the beginning of something that was going to sweep Europe, whether it would be Le Pen in France.
Look, the DUP is different because they're a bit like the Southern Democrats. They're profoundly reactionary. The DUP hates Catholics.
Mm-hmm. Right,
it's very British.
Ian Paisley was vicious.
No popery in Ulster and no buggery in Ulster as well. Remember,
he was vicious guy.
Yeah, and yet at the same time, they believed in the welfare state. Part of the DUP, and this is the thing now, is that part of their price they will exact is that Theresa May keeps sending big checks to Northern Ireland to maintain the welfare payments, to maintain subsidies, to keep the jobs going, to build the roads. This is a straight pork barrel operation that they'll be operating on.
Holding on right now. So now it's going to just, like, as you were saying earlier, total thievery.
Yeah.
Basically organized thievery in the court, in the sense of ideology, but thievery.
And also because she wants a hard Brexit, and they say no, because they mightn't like the Catholics in the south of Ireland, but they don't want a border put up there because it would screw their economy totally.
Right.
They want to be able to drive up and down to Dublin all the time.
Well, doesn't the United States invests in the south of Ireland much more than it does in the north of Ireland? So if they want to hook into American investment and markets, they're going to have to do it through Southern Ireland.
Yeah, but also, I mean, as a result of Clinton's involvement in the Ulster deal, there's money flows into both parts, and it's complex there because people here take it very. There's bigotry on both sides. Mm-hmm. Put it this way: when did you last see an Orange Lodge parading in the St. Patrick's Day parade? Everyone's going on about gays. Protestants aren't allowed, as far as I know, on the St. Patrick's Day parade.
I've never seen it.
So there's bigotry both ways here.
I've never seen it.
And I did a column for The Guardian a few years ago, and I said
that's interesting.
I'll believe in Irish unity when the Orange Lodge is part of the St. Patrick's Day parade in New York, banging their big drums and tooting the flute my father wore. Until then, it's not going to happen.
I saw all the former all the Catholic schools in which Irish of the South graduated from in the Bronx. Mount St. Michael, Fordham. Go one Spelman, one after another. I'm a product of that kind of education as well. And almost, most of the students these days are African American to go to these schools, and so there was large contingents of young African American people in the St. Patrick's Day parade, getting cheers from the previous generations graduates of those same high schools, which to some degree handed it over. But you still don't see a Protestant.
Yeah,
right, which is interesting. All right, which is an ancient hatred. Goes back.
That's not an ancient. Well, it's an ancient division. I wouldn't say it was a hatred.
It's going on for 800 years. 800 years of fighting each other.
They were on this in 1798. The leaders of the Irish Revolution were mostly Protestant. Wolfe Tone was a Protestant. Half the leaders of in 1916
what's going on with that?
were Protestants.
Right. And I just know a little bit, and I've read a few things. You're the expert. Tell me, what is that? I've tried to figure that out for years.
Well, it was De Valera and his wing of the Irish movement that turned it into a bigoted, a Catholic thing. I mean, look, if you were a Protestant in Northern Ireland and this Irish-American wacko in the South suddenly declared the Constitution and dedicated it to the Virgin Mary and claimed the whole country, you've got legitimate reasons to be a little leery about it.
Right.
It was not a clever move if your aim was to win the hearts and minds of the Protestants in the North.
So tell me, Ian Williams, what have you been working on lately? Because I know you're an expert as well as on all the issues we've talked about today, and you have such an interesting view on all of them. Whiskey and rum.
Well, I've finished.
Which is your latest one?
Well, my last book was on tequila. I can't remember
tequila. That's what it was.
I did Tequila, a global
history.
Right. Yes. But I've got a book of essays on George Orwell, which is highly appropriate, about to come out any moment.
Yes.
These are essays I've written over the years.
What about George Orwell? What's your take on Orwell, especially the Orwellianness of the current regime?
It's the Orwellianness. I mean, one of my essays, which I've just had to copy edit, is on the different meanings of Orwellian, because you have Orwellian in the bad sense of, like Big Brother beating you to death with rubber truncheons, Orwellian in the sense of George Orwell, who had a very sophisticated look at the world and didn't see things in black and white.
Right. Okay. I don't know much about how he saw things.
He could see that you shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. That you can fight for things which weren't perfect, and. I mean, 1984 is seen here as an anti-socialist tract. And
Yes.
Orwell himself
Yes.
said very strongly that he was a strong supporter of socialism. He was a strong supporter of the
Right.
British Labour government elected in 1945.
Then why
He
rip
was a
into
member.
their ideological
Well, he didn't.
godfathers? You know,
Because he was ripping into the Soviet Union and
how it was
Stalin and Trotsky and Lenin. And one of the
Right.
problems here in America is that a lot of the left are imbued. Trotsky sold a lot of American socialists that he was a cozy social democrat.
okay, yeah. I
When
was
in
wondering
fact-
about that. It's very. I would say that most American leftists are don't realize it, but they're much more in the Trotsky.
Yeah, I mean, they
Stalin. That's
took
small
over. They
groups.
infiltrated the socialist movement in America, and basically destroyed the strong indigenous
Right, that's what
American
you're saying.
democratic socialist
Right.
movement. Because Trotsky was a pretty nasty character. He wrote a book on
He's head of the Red
terrorism.
Army. I mean, that's like the armies don't go around and
Yeah, I mean,
like,
3
tickle
months.
you.
3 months after the mutiny in Kronstadt, he was shooting the mutineers.
Right, Kronstadt. That's where the anarchists are so will never forgive. Because
Yeah,
of
no,
that.
no,
Because
nobody
those are
would
the sailors of Kronstadt, and this is the 100th anniversary of the Russian
Yes.
Revolution. How does that? I wanted to bring it back in our last 5 minutes. How does this is all interesting? I love talking about it. We have 5 minutes. How do we relate this back to the era we're in now? Are we living in an era that is parallel to any of these times in history?
No, we should regard 1917 as an aberration. Bring back Kerensky.
Right. He was in WBAI. His not Kerensky, but his son.
Yeah.
Had a show for years and lived here in New York.
Yeah, I mean, Kerensky were the Mensheviks. They were social democrats, and they were trying to do things. They didn't shoot people who disagreed with them. It was the first thing the Bolsheviks did was to shoot anyone who disagreed with them, basically. They'd get away with. And they didn't allow it. And that's what happened in the American socialist movement. But the democratic socialists here, Bernie was in that old and honourable tradition. You know, Debs and all of the others, and Norman Thomas, and he brought it back to life. And Jeremy Corbyn did the same in Britain. They kept trying to paint him as some type of deranged Leninist, but he was in the mainstream hardcore British socialist tradition where you didn't need Lenin, you didn't need Trotsky. We had our own traditions.
But there are tough questions, right? There's one question is, because even Bernie is not, how are we ever going to disengage the West from this war on terrorism as long as there's not a true solution? We're talking about Northern Ireland and not Southern Ireland, a true solution to the Palestinian-Israeli question.
It's difficult. They're not going to be totally. I mean, that's one of the big bugbears of American foreign policy is that as long as you say that Israel operates by different rules from everyone else, even today, Nikki Haley, the American ambassador, was basically condemning the UN because it was passing resolutions condemning Israel for things that any other country would also be condemned for.
Right.
This is it. They're basically, the US is campaigning that Israel needs special treatment. And they're quite right that a lot of the Arab regimes have used beating Israel as an excuse. And they've almost devalued it because they passed so many resolutions. But the resolutions are true. The resolutions are accurate.
Right.
There's just far too many of them. Yeah,
Well, there's plenty of teeth against North Korea for lobbing a few.
Well, look at Nikki Haley last
rockets,
week. She goes to the Human Rights Council and says Venezuela is shocking, and North Korea is shocking.
Yeah.
Bahrain that very same week was shooting down protesters and locking and executing dissidents.
And
Bahrain is now one of our partners in the war against terrorism.
And,
I always think it sounds like the war against tourism, and I don't like tourists. So I'm almost in sympathy
it's
with
this
all
unending
this.
war. So we've had this unending war now for what, 20,
It's
almost
like
20
the war
years.
on drugs. Wars on abstractions never defeated, because how can you defeat an abstraction? It's going to be there regardless. And terrorism is what you define. I mean, I've lived all of my life in Britain where the IRA was blowing people up, other people were blowing things up.
Yeah.
And we have it now. Nobody thinks Timothy McVeigh is as a terrorist. Nobody thinks the war on terrorism encompasses white guys blowing things up or white guys going into churches and blowing. The war on terrorism is always the alien other.
Right. South Carolina, all the leaders, the top leaders of the Southern Black Church murdered, and something that was greater, and actually people are going on like it was nothing. We don't have songs about it. Nobody's talking about it, but it was like 10 Martin Luther King assassinations in one shot. And I think people don't realize how bitter that assassination was in South Carolina, in Charlotte. I think it was where in.
Well, I don't know this. This week, a judge released somebody on bail because Yes, he had white racist literature. Yes, he had explosive substances in there.
Yeah.
Yes, he was tied in with some shootings just before.
Yeah.
But this was no reason to think that he wasn't safe to let out on bail.
Right.
I mean, yeah. Can you
Because he was
imagine
a
if
white
his name was
American.
if his
Also,
name was
really, yeah.
Muhammad, he'd be up there, you know.
Right.
Sort of.
He's a white American,
Of
and
course.
that's. I think what we're discussing is that if you're a white American, the law really isn't really aimed at you. I mean, you might
Well,
fall
if
into
you're a
it.
white American communist or socialist
Right,
or
right,
union
right,
organizer,
right.
I think you'd find it.
Yeah,
They'd
I
make an
have.
exception for you. Yes.
I'm a sort of socialistic, and it has been rough. It's been a little rough. Yeah, they don't. Yeah, and the public. I mean, they don't even need the cops because the public, becomes enraged against people who are just trying to point out what's actually happening. And instead, they rush, often in large masses, to these fake news outlets, Alex Jones or Breitbart and things like that, and they believe the stuff. I mean, we have, this interview with Alex Jones just the other day, by Kelly. The blonde airhead, and it was like really sad, that he was getting the treatment of being a real news source when everything he says. I mean, Sandy Hook didn't happen. I mean, they're pretty crazy stuff. I mean, it's not just 9/11 inside story. I mean, that's looking more and more like a possibility 9/11 inside story, inside job.
I was there watching. I watched the plane.
You don't think
hit.
it was an inside job?
I watched the plane hit. I thought it was spectacular incompetence on the part of the FBI.
Yeah.
They had warning signals, but I have nothing but the profoundest contempt for the FBI, whose only success over the years has been chasing people like Martin Luther King and union organizers and Jimmy
That's all they
Hoffa.
really do.
And also, if you look,
Right.
almost every so-called terrorist plot the FBI solves is one they've started. They put in a paid informant who's convinced some stupid bozos.
Right.
So it's an exercise in anti-Darwin. It's Darwinian. It's not terrorism. They find people stupid enough to be led into doing these things, and then they arrest them because they've given them the weapons.
Bombing like that. Yeah. That's a story that hasn't really been told. We don't know really what happened with the Boston Marathon bombing because there was an investigation going on before the bombing happened, and there seems to have been some prior knowledge that something was going on that wasn't acted on.
If you remember the very first World Trade Center bombing, I wrote about that.
Yes, I do.
I mean, that was a blind Egyptian sheikh who was definitely profoundly anti-Egyptian, and he'd have definitely put a bomb under the Egyptian embassy. But it was a paid informant who was an Egyptian Secret Service agent who led them all on and did them all and inveigled them into it, and the guys died.
The thought it all up.
In jail.
We have 20 seconds to go. I actually know Imad Salem, and I'm going to have him on the show sometime. He listens a lot, I guess. That's the informant we're talking about. So we have 10 seconds. How you doing? Hey, we have 10 seconds. What do you want to add and sum up?
Well, I think that what happened with Jeremy Corbyn is in some ways even more significant than happened with Bernie because it's consolidated. The Labour Party is going to be completely different. We're going to have a real two-party system in Britain with a real opposition. He's brought out the youth vote on an unprecedented scale, and all options are up for grabs now. And even all of the traitors. You remember the old British working class song was the traitors sneer.
Okay.
We'll keep the red flag. Though cowards flinch and traitors sneer, we'll keep the red flag flying here. And that's what's going to happen in Britain now, because all of those traitors who sneered are now coming back to the fold because they saw that Jeremy Corbyn could actually win elections.
I see. All right. Thank you, Ian Williams, for joining us on Let Them Talk.
Thanks.
All right.